Okay, welcome folks. See folks entering the space. Welcome everyone. We're going to get started in just a moment. Welcome folks. We'll give everyone a few minutes to enter the room and then we'll get started in a moment. And we'll give folks about 30 more seconds to get settled in before we begin. All right, the time is about 2 minutes after. So hello everyone. My name is Avery Arrington. I use she and her pronouns. On behalf of the National Center on Restorative Justice, we welcome you to our webinar discussion on restorative justice and police. Today's webinar is a part of a larger themed webinar series the National Center is sponsoring called Restorative Justice in the Criminal Legal System. Over the course of this year, webinar topics will focus on system actor-driven content that hopefully will contribute to the larger conversations happening around the country. And for those who are learning about the National Center for the first time, welcome. The National Center on Restorative Justice, also known as NCORJ, is a federally funded cooperative agreement between Vermont Law and Graduate School, the University of San Diego, the University of Vermont, and the U.S. Office of Justice Programs, in which the Bureau of Justice Assistance is a component of and is our federal funding partner. So please visit our website at ncorj.org to learn more about our work in the areas of public education, higher education, as well as research. But before I turn it over to our moderator for today, I just want to thank you all again for tuning in. I'd like to acknowledge that today's conversation is just a start. We hope to have time at the end for questions to answer, but please feel free to engage us throughout the webinar, ask your questions. Someone on the back end will be monitoring those questions. But for today, folks, we only have 75 minutes to talk about restorative justice and police. That is nowhere near enough time. I want to be clear and encourage folks to submit your questions, but also fill out that survey at the end that will be made available after today's webinar. Let us know where you would like to take this conversation next. I think that is super important. But that's all I'll say for now. I will turn it over to Sydney. She'll give specifics on what and whom you'll be hearing from. Thank you again, folks, and take care. Over to you, Sydney.
Awesome. Thanks, Avery, and welcome, everyone. We're really excited to have you here today. It is a big topic in a small amount of time, so I will dive right into it with you all. Just to introduce myself, my name is Sydney Pigeon. I'm your moderator for today. I'm a daughter and a wife of 2 San Diego Police Department officers and a restorative justice practitioner. My research in RJ, or restorative justice, focuses on restorative approaches to policing, as well as the reconciliation of community harm. I'm really honored to be here to support this conversation and introduce you to our 3 incredible panelists. But before I do that, I would love to lay some groundwork about what to expect and what you all can anticipate for today. So many of you may have heard of restorative justice for police, and maybe you have hands-on experience engaging in this type of work within your roles or within your departments. And whether you're here because you've done all this work before, you could moderate this panel, you could be on this panel, or if you're a little bit apprehensive about this term, maybe you haven't participated or engaged with it, or have some questions about what it might look like in practice, we hope that you can place all of those assumptions aside. Really listen in the next hour, 75 minutes, about what these three panelists have done and see how it might be applicable to your role or to your department. And like Avery said, there's a variety of conversations and topics we can have relating to restorative practices within our communities, within police departments. But really, we want to focus in on two specific questions. The first question is, what is restorative justice, specifically in the context of police? And why is it beneficial for you as police officers in your roles? So these questions will be addressed by the three practitioners who have really spearheaded some of this transformational restorative work taking place related to police. So as you all are aware, policing has been a topic of conversation over the past few years. And government officials, policymakers, community leaders, police departments, you all are looking for ways to maybe meet the universal goal of community safety. All the work the panelists will discuss today is founded on principles of restorative justice, which is a way to prevent or respond to harm with an emphasis on healing, social support, and active accountability. RJ, or restorative justice, is not a new concept whatsoever, and it's not a soft approach to harm. Really, it's a holistic approach that allows for sustainable change for the individuals involved as well as the larger community. In the growth of restorative justice in the past few years, there's been a lot of support because of the cost-effective nature of this approach, the higher victim satisfaction rates, and the real reduction in recidivism. So we hope that this webinar can provide some examples for how you or your department can adopt RJ to meet some of your department's pressing needs, and of course, support the communities that you all serve. So in these three panelist discussions, you might hear about restorative justice in a few new ways or a few new terms. We'll talk about harmed parties and responsible parties. This is a little bit of a language shift or new language than maybe what you've used before relating to people or folks involved in a crime or an incident. The common terms of victim or offender might be shifted to survivor or harmed party, and then responsible party. There's a power in this language shift, and some of these new or different terms can help remind us that we're more than the worst thing that's ever happened to us or the worst thing we've ever done. So with that foundation, we are going to have an overview of logistics for the next hour. Each of the panelists will discuss their work, and just like Avery said, at the end of the webinar, we hope to have time for some questions. Throughout this presentation, you have access to ask questions, and please do so. All of those questions will be monitored, and then at the end of all three conversations, we'll dive into those questions, and one or more of the panelists will be able to answer them for you. So before we dive into these conversations, I would love to know who is in the room with us today. I know there's a lot of folks that are here and probably other folks watching the recording later, but we're going to start with the most essential question. What do you think is the best snack combo while working? So feel free to use that poll and answer what you think is the best snack. Donuts and coffee, stereotypical, but at least from what I understand, pretty accurate. Bagels and lattes, chips and Red Bull, protein bar and water. That's definitely the most healthy option, but you never know. All of them could be good. Maybe some for Monday, some for Tuesday. Let's see what you all have answered. I'll give myself an answer too. All right. So let's see what we've got. Oh, okay, more of a split than I was anticipating. Donuts and coffee, the stereotypical answer. Also the answer that 38% of you put. Not so much chips and Red Bull. That's not a big fan of these folks. That's all right. Bagels and lattes, that'd probably be my option. Protein bar and water. Awesome. Thanks for answering that. That is helpful as I am possibly getting my dad or Zach, my husband, some snacks after this for coming to this event. So for this next question, we've got, what have you heard about restorative justice? Maybe you've heard that it's an extra tool for your job, that it helps in the community. It's a way to build relationships, maybe within your departments, maybe with the larger community. It doesn't work for everything. And maybe you haven't heard much. This is your first time kind of getting that foundational conversation about restorative justice. Any of these answers are completely fine, and these polls are anonymous, so feel free to answer freely for all of them. All right, let's see what we got here. Again, pretty across the board. A lot of folks seeing that it helps with their community. Maybe it's an extra tool or a way to build relationships. And a lot of you have heard something about restorative justice. Only 5% of you haven't heard much. That's great. Thanks for sharing. And our final question before we dive into it, how much experience have you had with restorative justice? So first, what have you heard? And now how much experience do you have? A lot. You've sat in on maybe a restorative circle or a conference. Not too much, but you're familiar, or none at all. Again, any of these answers are completely fine. We're really just trying to gauge who's in our room so we can tailor our conversation and make it most useful for all of you. Give you all another second. Oh, a lot. Awesome. So a lot of you have experience in restorative justice. So you might be in the seat where you could probably be in my seat right now, doing the hosting of this space. Some folks have sat on a restorative circle, some folks not too much, but familiar, and a few of you no experience at all. Again, all of those experiences and knowledge bases of restorative justice are welcome here because this really is a foundational conversation where we're going to be hearing from a few different folks about how they have implemented restorative practices in the criminal justice system or in their own spaces related to police. So the first person that we are going to hear from is Josh Bacon. He would have answered a lot to that last question. He is the author of I Screwed Up, Now What? 7 Practices to Make Things Right and Conquer Adversity. He serves as an administrator, faculty member, trainer, mentor during his extensive career supporting students and young people. He received his PhD, master's degree, and is a graduate of the Central Shenandoah Criminal Justice Training Academy. He also served as a campus safety officer at Bridgewater College. So I'll pass it over to Josh now to discuss a comprehensive restorative approach to self-care for police officers.
Thank you, Sydney. And before we get started, let's do another question, another poll that kind of relates to self-care. How much time do you have for self-care in your work? A lot of time, not too much time, but try to make time. I'm working on it. Or what? Self-care? Go ahead and answer, and we'll see what we have. Okay, not too much, but trying to make time. Good, 50%. Working on it, and just a few, not what self-care. Okay, great, thank you. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So what makes, you heard Dean of Students, 21 years in higher education, a PhD, teaching at a college university. What makes me go into police work or think about police work? And I will tell you, was one of the best parts of my job as Dean of Students, and I did conduct, was working with the police officers and working with crisis situations and going to calls of students who are what we call a clear and present danger. Love the police, love the atmosphere, love the loyalty, the team atmosphere of it. So that's what drew it to me. Also, what was going on with the police and law enforcement at the time, I wanted to see for myself, how can I help, what's going on? So after retiring at age 50, I went to work at Bridgewater College campus. And as you can see, I'm sure most of y'all or many of y'all know these two gentlemen. They were my partners, and they were killed in the line of duty, John Painter and J.J. Jefferson. And I will tell you, they were two of the most selfless people I've ever met in my life. And they talked a 50-year-old retired dean of students into going to the police academy and to give back. And I really went in thinking, what's this training going to be like? How can I help? What's wrong with this training? And I will tell you, it was the most impressive training I've ever been through in my life, by far. As you saw, I went to the Central Shenandoah Criminal Justice Training Academy, just the most intentional, detailed training I've ever been to. And what stood out, and as you can imagine, 21 years of working with students, all the instructors and all the volunteer instructors were selfless beyond belief. I just love the atmosphere and how much they gave up. Same with the majority of the recruits. We're very selfless individuals. So when I looked, again, the training was amazing. My 50-year-old body somehow got through it. But I remember kind of the mental health and the self-care training. We did one day on it. We read a really good book on it. But kind of the theme was, it is what it is. And that's good for getting you day to day through the, as you all know, the difficult call, on to the next call, having to work a double shift. It's that Stoic philosophy. It is what is. I've just got to get on to the next one. But I will tell you, from a lifetime of working with struggling people and helping people with self-care, that has long-term effects. It's day to day, but it doesn't get you through a lifetime healthy. And if there's anything I could give back to the selfless profession, and you all know the effects, alcohol, divorce, diabetes, health issues, all those different things. I would also say new officers are coming in with a little bit of a different attitude. I imagine less of a selfless mindset of the older generation. They want to know what's in it for them. And as you know, in terms of this is about recruitment, retention, and officer well-being. And I'd say the younger officers are going to want this. They know that they can go anywhere to get a job because everyone's looking, but they also don't want to give up everything, and are not as selfless as I would say the older generation. So to me, if you can go to the next slide. This moment, this is one of my favorite quotes, and I use it in my book. Fate whispers to the warrior, you cannot withstand the storm. The warrior whispers back, I am the storm. And to me, self-care has the benefits in those crisis situations and those unbelievably difficult moments that I just had a glimpse by going through the academy and being a campus safety officer. I only had a glimpse of what that must be like. But long-term self-care and investing in this, what I would call restorative self-care, will help you in these crisis, difficult moments. So to me, if you can go to the next slide. This is my book, 7 Practices to Make Things Right and Conquer Adversity. I would love if you all could look at it. Again, implementing these self-care, these 7 practices, this is what works. Now, the stories are not going to be as relatable for police officers. It's more from my work with college students, but the practices are sound. And they build resiliency, grit, they help with retention, they would help with recruitment and overall wellness. So to me, it is what it is. You've got to find a way to share. And that's one of the things that so many of the officers I talk to, they just don't share because they're busy. They're on from one call to the next. I heard so many stories of difficult situations, difficult issues, sad things, and they had to go on the next and they didn't share it. So what happens to that when you don't share it? And that leads to the self-talk, the negative self-talk, the difficult self-talk. And that's where we use other things to cope and get through the day and say it is what it is. Alcohol, coffee, energy drink, sugar, all those other negative things to kind of prevent that self-talk. So this is a different way of using restorative justice. It's using the practices. The pillars of restorative justice are harms, needs, and obligations. So how do you look at self-care from all the framework? And so much of us, and even with police, there's so much on physical self-care. And a lot of us do a good job with that. But there's something called the wellness wheel. There's lots of other areas of self-care. So looking at that restoratively, what are my needs? What are my financial needs? What are my social needs? What are my emotional needs? What are my spiritual needs? And my physical needs as well. And what are my obligations? And using restorative practices, whether it's restorative journaling, restorative mentoring, or restorative circle processes. And to me, I know this because I've used it with a lot of different people. Some police officers, as you know, I would never journal. I'm never going to sit down and write. That's not me. That's okay. Restorative mentoring. Would you sit one-on-one with someone and share and talk about things? Or if that doesn't work with you, a circle process. But implementing all those 3 options in a restorative way of looking at your self-care, that to me is what the younger generation is going to want. It's going to lead to long-term health, long-term retention, and it's going to help with recruitment as well. If you can go to the next slide, I believe there's one more. So these are the things a little bit about needs and obligations. And to me, when you start doing this work of self-care with restorative practices on yourself, and then you start building that self-care and that community in your department, then you can apply it to conflict. And then you can apply it to community relationships because you see how it works. And I will tell you, I was more skeptical about restorative justice than anybody when I started it. I was dean of students and used to sitting behind a desk punishing or educating students. And when I said we're going to sit in a circle and we're going to talk this different way, I was blown away how it worked. So to me, getting back and using these principles and these practices, to me, implementing that will really help with the recruitment needs right now, the retention needs, and really the overall wellness of officers. And that when you learn that language individually with yourself, you're using it in your community, and then you're going to hear from my colleagues here, then you can go and start doing it to build community, and then to deal with the hardest things, conflict, and even with criminal violations and deferment and things like that. But to me, this is really looking at restorative practices in a different way. So with that, I will pass it back to Sydney.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh, for sharing the depth of content in the short time that you did in your book. I've read your book. I know the depth of and breadth of work that you've done in restorative justice. So I really appreciate your very abridged version of some of what you've done. So our next speaker is Vanessa Wesley. She's a retired 30-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department, an Illinois state certified law enforcement trainer. She's currently the Illinois Restorative Justice Coordinator for Healing Beyond Harm, and she has a depth of knowledge and hands-on experience in the field, working with both survivors and responsible parties by using restorative justice as a centerfold for repairing harm and creating safer communities. Her work is really incredible, and I will let it speak for herself. So I will pass it over to you, Vanessa.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again for joining us for this brief but necessary discussion. As a servant of the public, as a police officer for over 30 years, and if you count my county time, that's like almost 35 years, it is imperative that I think we begin to look at the tools that we've been given and sharpen them in a way. But before we get into all that, I have a few questions that I want to ask you. Something that you think about for this next 5 minutes. What is the hardest part of your job? What is the hardest part of your job? And let's like, I'm not sure if it took a long time, but do we have the answers, or do you want to go to the second question? What did y'all say to that? Lack of resources and staffing, absolutely. Some of you guys, have concerns about how we build relationship now, resolving conflict. Seems like it never goes away. But interestingly enough, the hardest thing, the easiest thing is enforcing the laws because they're black and white, right? You know what they are, they're not going to change, and it's either this or that. Thank you for that. Got one more for you. What is the most frustrating part of the traditional criminal justice system as you see it? What make you kick the squad car tires? Think about that. And submit your answers. And let's see what we came up with. So interesting, kind of got a 4-way, but little limited or no accountability and repeated calls for repeat people. Yeah, that'll make me kick a tire too. It really would, because it speaks to what we look at as job success. What do we look at as how we're being measured, that we're doing the best we can? We relied on numbers for so many years, and now even the numbers are starting to get cloudy. Next slide. So for me, with the Chicago Police Department, I had the pleasure to fall into restorative justice. And restorative justice became an option for us when we were answering some of the similar questions that you've answered today. We had to figure out different ways to do the job that we were called to do. It was easy to enforce the laws because there were no gray areas. But when the laws began to become gray, we realized that we did not have the relationships necessary for change. First point. The basic premise or the base premise of RJ is community. We cannot activate any of the principles, pillars, practices without a relationship with the community that we are implementing in. And that was hard to really understand, because for many years I thought we were the police, we were the superheroes, we came packing capes and everything else. However, what we found out is that relationships are first and foremost equitable, honest, and require nurturing. And as a police officer, we didn't often get the chance to do that running from call to call. Next point. Successful law enforcement in any community safety endeavor is the fact that we have to stop doing things to the community, but with the community, which required us to really look at how do we build relationships that solve problems. The third point being law enforcement strategies should consider law enforcement members to be members of the community they serve and not necessarily the outside looking in. I think the premise of us versus them has done more damage than they have good. As we have evolved into where we are now. I don't know about you all, and I'm not sure who's also participating, but I'm part of that dinosaur generation where you had Adam 12 as heroes and those types of things. And now it looks a little different. You know, Adam 12 versus the bad boys are kind of two different things. But what was necessary in any aspect, in any evolution of law enforcement, is the relationship that we have with our community. Next slide. So what helped us really to understand is that the community is really the best source of solution for the challenges that they were having in areas of public safety. When you allow people to be their experts in their own crises and support that, we have the benefit of sustainability as well as buy-in, meaning that we had a collective accountability. That it wasn't just finger pointing, and it was easier to understand that, and the burden of public safety was easier to shoulder. Next point. In fact, we realized that in this particular implementing the principles of restorative justice really helped us to realize that what happens in one part of the city really happens to us all, because we are truly all connected. So collectively coming together, we have found that we are stronger together. And as in the voice of one of my mentors, we can do more together than we can separately. Next point, I think I got one more. So understanding the relationship between community and the community members who are charged with public safety. Y'all catch that we're not outside of the community, but we're part of the community. Our job is just to really implement and do the things to keep the community safe, right? The idea is that we create collaborative leadership opportunities so collective wisdom can surface. Restorative justice is just that. If you ever get a chance to sit in a circle, you realize that nobody's voice is louder, greater, or better than anybody else in that circle. And even to the point, the way that we're postured, we're sitting in a circle so that we can all be eye level, no matter how tall you are. What does that mean? Your voice, your contribution, your solutions are just as important as anybody else in the community. But when we come together, we're greater. And we have a better chance of creating safer environments than we've ever had. Next slide. I think I have one more, I'm not sure. Okay, so just for right quick, this is one of my favorite pictures and will be forever. This is the first class of restorative justice practitioners for the Chicago Police Department. These 25 brave souls followed me into a room with a circle in a center and had no idea what was about to happen to them. And as of this time, these individuals have taken restorative justice to personal practice, to where they realize the power of collaboration, the power of the connection, and have great successes in many projects from youth, I would say from 8 to 80. And I believe that's an opportunity for every law enforcement entity that's on this call today. And with that, I will pass it back to Sydney.
Thank you, Vanessa, and thank you for sharing the ways that RJ can honor a community, police being a part of that community as well, especially where it needs it most prominently. Your work is so important, and your years in law enforcement give you a very unique perspective on how to use RJ in the job as well as in the community. So we'll transition next to our final panelist, Tiffany Cruzy, who has worked within law enforcement agencies throughout Washington State for 15 years. She's bridged the gap between victims of crime and law enforcement through her roles as Law Enforcement Integrated Victim Services Coordinator and a Domestic Violence Coordinator. She has really extensive experience, and her and I have had the opportunity to chat a few different times about the work that she's doing. And she, with that experience, established Bridge Coordinator Services, which is a service designated to provide law enforcement integrated victim services. So I'll pass it off to Tiffany to talk more about what that looks like in practice.
Thank you so much, Sydney. I want to share that I too have something in common with Sydney. I am a daughter and a sister of law enforcement officers. My father retired from the LAPD and then came up to Washington to work as a assistant chief and a chief of police up here. And both of my brothers are involved in law enforcement. So the three of us have kind of made our way into the field. It's a little bit of the family business. So I'm excited to be here with you all and have the opportunity to share my time with you, and thank you for sharing your time with us. So I'm going to talk about how implementing law enforcement integrated victim services within law enforcement agencies is actually one piece to the restorative justice process. And it's something that can be integrated into your agencies that it'll begin the shift towards restorative justice for your community. The shift provides voice for those impacted by harm, and it allows for transparency and engagement in the criminal justice system. So I have a philosophy on law enforcement victim coordinators or law enforcement integrated victim services. It helps create a dialogue between law enforcement agencies and victims of crime. And then that will lead to further strengthening and creating partnership within our community. When victims believe that they are treated appropriately by law enforcement, they're more willing to come forward with information that helps solve crimes. And providing a venue for voice in the process for those who've been harmed helps the forward movement in mending those harms that are done. So we all know those who are impacted by harm in the criminal justice process are generally the least involved in the criminal case. They're contacted by law enforcement, they give their statements, and then the case gets kicked off to the prosecutors. And then it's a waiting game. They wait and wait, sometimes months, in order to hear anything about their criminal case. And that provides a burden for those who have been harmed. And what about the cases that never go to trial or never go before a prosecutor? Those individuals have still been harmed, yet they don't necessarily have a voice in the process. By having law enforcement integrated victim services in your agencies, that allows for people to have voice in the process. So what does a victim coordinator do? And what are the benefits to those impacted by harm? Victim coordinators educate and assist victims of crime as they navigate through the criminal justice process and cases that are forwarded to the prosecutor for review or aren't. So this covers civils, like civil calls or disturbances or suspicious calls for service when someone's impacted by harm and then they call and have some questions. Victim coordinators can help meet the needs of a victim using a trauma-informed and victim-centered response by engaging in direct contact with those victims following an incident of harm. They engage in trauma-informed communication that focuses on safety and voice. That's something that's really important to me, is when I talk with those who've been impacted by harm, first and foremost, I want to talk about their safety. And being integrated into a law enforcement agency, that gives me an opportunity to speak to them about their safety from a law enforcement standpoint. We get to assess those who have been impacted by harm and their immediate needs and help provide appropriate resource referrals. These are things that are done over the phone or in person, or sometimes when we send off emails. We provide opportunity for immediate and direct follow-up with investigations in a law enforcement support role. So we support the integrity of a criminal case. As we know, with restorative justice, it doesn't necessarily mean instead of the traditional criminal justice process. Restorative practices can be integrated into the traditional practice. I had a conversation a couple of months ago with both Josh and Vanessa, and we were talking about how law enforcement serves two roles in restorative justice, in deflection and diversion. The victim services side is truly more of a diversion side, simply because the case has been forwarded to the prosecutor's office, and it's already involved in the criminal justice system versus a diversion. So that's kind of the difference, just throwing it out there. We're giving you so much information today. I just wanted to provide that little nugget that we all shared. But victim coordinators also serve as a direct line of communication for those impacted by harm. So we support the mission of restorative justice by bridging that information gap between victims of crime, law enforcement agencies, and prosecution services. And we provide victims voice in the process as well. That's why I named my company Bridge Coordination Services. I wanted to bridge that gap between victims of crime and those impacted by harm, law enforcement, and prosecution. All right. So this gets down to the meat and potatoes. What's the benefit of having law enforcement victim coordinators, and what is that benefit to you? Well, victim coordinators speak your language. They speak the language of law enforcement, and they understand what law enforcement can and can't do. We're different than community-based advocates. We are engaged in the criminal justice system, and we have some of the same reporting requirements of mandatory reporting as law enforcement officials. So that helps keep the transparency of documenting crimes and calls for service within a law enforcement agency. Integrated victim service coordinators have in-depth knowledge of the dynamics of working with law enforcement and the criminal justice system. Community-based advocates don't have access to criminal justice databases and information where you can quickly go in, get information related to a criminal case, and provide case numbers to victims, or provide them with the information on how to do a public records request so they can get copies of paperwork when they want to go and get their own protection orders. So it's saving time from patrol officers answering those calls for services and those questions that come in that would take an officer off the road for 20 to 30 minutes to talk to a victim on the phone, when you have somebody in the department that's able to talk to them right away. They do serve as that liaison between the law enforcement agency, prosecutors, and victims of violence-related crimes. And they meet those victims with a trauma-informed and a trauma victim-centered response to follow up with questions, to talk about how they're feeling and what their needs are. So how does this help our officers and deputies on the road? Well, we can field some of those case-related questions that would often be directed to patrol or investigations or supervisors when it's something that has to do with a court date or something in reference to resources. That information can be handled at a different level and not take our patrol officers away from the road. Additionally, we can obtain follow-up statements and additional information from those impacted by harm. That information could get added to the police report and sent off to the prosecutor's office for review. That includes when victims want to share that they're feeling differently today than they were the date of the incident. That's really important, to provide that voice to victims and still be very transparent in the reporting process. For admin, this is for those administrators out there. You get those measurable outcomes you're looking for to support engagement in restorative practices. So your victim coordinators can provide you statistical data and report on population served, how often, what types of services they needed. You get demographic reports and information, all from people that you would normally be engaging with. And it's really important when you're taking that to city or county executives to show that you are actually impacting your community in a restorative manner, and you've got the documentation to prove it. I think additionally, it's important to be able to say, these are the experiences of those who have been impacted by harm within our agency, and they are they are returning to us in the way of informal advocacy. I've had many victims that have called me after they've been impacted by harm months or years later saying, hey, I know somebody else that's experiencing something that I experienced. Can I have them call you and talk through this with you? I think that speaks volumes for what our officers and what our agencies are doing to engage with our community. And then lastly, when I talk about the benefits, we got to have the benefits for prosecution as well. So how does this help with prosecution? Victim coordinators communicate case-related information to the prosecutors that reflects the concerns for the victim's safety from a law enforcement standpoint. And we also see not just the crimes that have been committed, but also calls for service where no arrest was made. So I talked a little bit about that earlier with civils disturbances, verbal calls, noise complaints, suspicious calls where parties have been contacted by law enforcement, but there's no crime. But it's important for the prosecutors to know, especially those verbal arguments between parties, if we're looking at domestic violence related calls, that there has been law enforcement contact prior, that we've tried to de-escalate situations, and now we're back at the household again and again. Most importantly, I think we get to share the voice of the victim, even when it's in opposition of the concerns for the law enforcement agency's safety concerns. So I will always share my safety concerns with the prosecutor, but I also share the voice of the victim and say, this is really what they want. It's all about transparency. So the victim knows that the coordinators are going to share their voice. And essentially what that does is it builds relationships. It builds that transparency and that trustworthiness. So when something happens again, they'll come back and they may have a different conversation with us the second or third time around. And then we get to provide those case-related updates as victims want what they'd like to see happen with cases. Even in the cases outside of the field of domestic violence, I've had many victims call and tell me, I really want this person to get help. They need to have anger management classes, or it's clear that they have substance use disorder issues. I really would like to have them get that help. And so having victim coordinators who are able to speak to that really helps move the process along for the prosecutors as well. So in recap, and we've got a recap little slide. So victim coordinators can meet the need to bridge that partnership gap between law enforcement agencies by addressing victim issues and concerns directly with our law enforcement agency and the prosecutors, so the victims know, hey, we're going to share your information with the people who need to know how you're feeling. Victim coordinators understand the importance of providing support to victims of crime and those who have been impacted by harm, recognizing that a victim's decision-making is really important and being respectful of their choices, all the while still sharing our safety concerns and all of the concerns that we have from a law enforcement perspective. This is just one piece of the implementation of a restorative justice approach to policing, but this piece truly focuses on the direct impact of harm on an individual. Restorative justice, again, is trying to mend those harms done. And unfortunately, in the traditional criminal justice process, victims are usually the voice that's heard the least. And this type of practice allows for the harmed party to share how the incident impacted them directly, and allows for them to engage in solutions seeking to mend the harms that are done. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany. I really appreciate that context because your work really is transformational, both for victims, for survivors, and for the community and law enforcement officers as well. All right, so today we've heard some really great content about self-care for officers, building safer communities, supporting survivors in the way that they need it most. And the speakers today not only have these great ideas and are great presenters, creating great slides, they've seen it in practice, and they've seen the impact of restorative justice for individuals and within their communities. So although these stories and examples are great, numbers also are important when you're determining if or how to implement restorative justice in your departments. So on this next slide, we're going to go through a few different statistics that we have. So research on restorative justice consistently indicates a high degree of satisfaction with the process on both the part of the victim and harm party and also the offender or responsible party. Also, it shows significantly decreased rates of recidivism. So we're going to look at a few statistics from a meta-analysis of 31 published studies in 2014 that found these satisfaction and recidivism rates. And we're going to see how close you all can get to some of the findings. So we're going to reintroduce that poll for everyone. And our first question that we have is, what do you think is the recidivism rate after participating in restorative justice? 3%, maybe 15%, maybe getting a little bit higher, 26%, or all the way up to 46%. A good guess is a good guess. We do have a right answer for this one. All right. Awesome. So if we transfer to the next slide, we can see that correct answer. You all, a few people said 3%, a lot of you said 15%, 26% is the correct answer, and 24% of you all got it right. Got a lot of statistics coming at you today. So 26% is the recidivism rate after participating in restorative justice. And as you all know, that is much lower than what it traditionally would be for folks that did not participate in any sort of restorative justice work. So for our next question, what do you think is the satisfaction rate of victims or survivors and their supporters participating in restorative justice? So victims or survivors who participated in restorative justice. 15%, 35%, 85%, or 97%. Got a good range here. Let's see what our answers are. Awesome. Wow. Did you all see these slides before? 85% is the correct answer, and a lot of you got that right. That's awesome. So really, the satisfaction rate of victims and survivors and their supporters participating in restorative justice is 85%. That number speaks for itself of the impact that this work can have. Got a few more questions for you, just 2 of them. Our next one is, what do you think is the satisfaction rate of offenders or responsible parties and their supporters participating in restorative justice? So this is the other side. Offenders and responsible parties and their supporters. What's their satisfaction rate? 5%, 25%, 50, and 89. One of them is the correct answer. Give you all another second. Awesome. 89%. That is the correct answer as well. So a lot of you got that right. 89% of offenders and responsible parties and their supporters is the satisfaction rate, which is pretty great. So 85% for victims and survivors and 89% for offenders and responsible parties. Awesome. And our final question, how would you describe restorative justice? The panelists and conversations may have sparked 1, 2, or all of these for you all. So we hope that you can see the impact that RJ can have, regardless of which answer you choose. RJ can be shared responsibility between the community and police, meaningful accountability, ways to build relationships, building resiliency with staff, or all of the above. Let's see what you all said. All of the above. Awesome. So most of you put that, which is great. All of these answers are correct, of course, but all of the above encompasses all of them. The foundation of RJ is more than just dealing with an incident. It's about being cooperative and having shared responsibility, taking meaningful accountability, being in a relationship with one another, and building resiliency within your departments and with the community and your own approach to your roles. So I'm hoping that the speakers spark some ideas, maybe some intrigue about how restorative justice can be used in your jobs in law enforcement. And it also may have sparked some questions. So feel free, if you haven't already, place your questions in the chat and we will go through some of them together. Let's see. We have our first question already. This is awesome. So this one, as a coordinator for this position was brought into the agency. Let me read this through real quick. Okay, so as a coordinator, was this position brought to the agency or something that the agency sought out due to an incident. So this is over to you, Tiffany. This is greatly needed in-house, in addition to having the district attorney's office having victim witness advocates as well.
Yes. So when I originally started working in this career field, there was already an established victim coordinator program with the agency that I worked for. And there were a couple other, so I work in Snohomish County, Washington, and there were a couple other agencies that had victim coordinators, but nobody that was full-time. And I received a call from a chief of police who knew me, and he said, "Hey kid, you think you could do this for me part-time?" And so that actually just got the ball rolling. And as more and more law enforcement agencies heard about this, and they heard about the services that were being provided to their organization, or could be provided to their organization and their communities, they reached out to have this type of service provided. So I did basic feasibility studies to see what they would need and how they could implement that into their program or into their own agencies, what type of programmings that they would need and how many hours. And so it has now flourished and is in 4 other agencies outside of the one that I started with, 4 other agencies that my company has contracts with. We're hopefully working on our 5th one, which is a pretty big contract here in Washington State. And so I'm really excited as it moves forward, because these are all people who want to have their communities supported with the opportunity to have their voice heard and to help support their law enforcement agencies as well. So the development and implementation is kind of customized and custom tailored to meet the needs of each agency based on calls for service, not population size. So there's ways in which, like, if you're looking forward to your own agency implementing something like this, you can look at it from a call for service standpoint. That's probably the best approach.
So thank you, Tiffany, for that response. And also it shows the impact of your work and the impact of working directly with victims or survivors, the way that it's growing in Washington and growing interest across the nation as well. So for our next question, are there any law enforcement concerns they have or recommendations to ensure safety guardrails for survivors of violence who engaged in RJ practices? So this can be passed over to Vanessa or Josh if either of you have a response. Go ahead.
So I think we both can respond. I'll be quick. The question being guardrails and providing safety. Again, understanding that restorative justice is a community connected foundation and relationships. It's important that the relationship between any law enforcement agent and that survivor is clear, meaning that we understand, because each person's crisis is different. So making sure that we understand how that survivor is feeling and create the protections that we need in order for that person to move forward in their healing. Josh?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is restorative justice. And if you get into this work and you go into the training, you'll hear the pre-conferencing and the pre-circle processes, meeting with all people involved. There's many times when you meet with people, and if you've had any gut feeling or any feeling that people aren't going to be safe, you don't do it. Restorative justice is not for any case, for every case. If there's any chance of someone being hurt or harmed more, you would not do the case. There's also other ways of doing surrogate people involved, or diplomacy or shuttle diplomacy, where they're not meeting face to face or even meeting online. So there's many different tools that restorative practices have to make sure things are safe. That's probably one of the first priorities, and one of the pillars of restorative justice is the pre-work that goes into it before any actual meeting takes place.
Thank you both for your responses. Definitely echo both of those. So this is a similar question, but switching gears with relating to police participating in these practices. So one of our attendees wrote, the police department that they work in has a restorative justice center embedded in their police department, and they found it to be extremely beneficial to their community. I bet it is. Does anyone have any suggestions on reducing stigmas associated with the police if an officer is going to be a part of a restorative panel? We found negative stigmas that affect officers' ability to partake in panel processes. Yeah, Josh, feel free to go ahead with that one.
Yeah, I'd say with restorative practices, restorative justice, one of the first things you do is relationship building. And if you have a circle or a conference, you're not even going to talk about why you're there potentially to begin with. You're just going to get to know each other. You may ask a question where everyone shares something similar or something in common or something meaningful if they're from the same community, which they usually are. And it just builds that relationship and it builds that trust, and it helps people see law enforcement as human, the humanity involved.
If I could piggyback off of that as well, Sydney. First, we have regulated, law enforcement has regulated the practice of restorative justice in such a small box for where it's just transactional for mediating a harm that has been caused, or to do inside of a room that you can do in the courtroom. But the reality of it is that the stigma changes once the relationship is made. And I say that because when young people saw officers that had body art like theirs, the wall began to melt because they saw commonality. Josh mentioned the importance of re-establishing and lifting up the humanity, not just of officers, but the communities that we served. So, I believe that the stigma would change when the efforts on relationship is increased, and it doesn't have to be a big push. It doesn't have to be a costly push, but it's given opportunities to see the humanity in one another. And then when the hard stuff shows up, then we are able to see each other differently, listen to each other differently, and collectively create a space of solution differently.
Awesome. Thank you, Vanessa. And I think part of sharing humanity is sharing stories. That's part of restorative justice, and that's part of connection. So I'd love to hear a story from each of you about how you've experienced, what your experience is implementing restorative justice. So maybe Vanessa, you could share a little bit about training officers in Chicago. Maybe Josh, a little bit about your experience involving campus police and conferencing. And then Tiffany, maybe your work on both sides of the impact for victims and the impact of police departments on implementing victim services. So Tiffany, if you want to go ahead and go first, and then whoever wants to go next is welcome to.
Sure. I think that one of the successes, or the things that I measure my success by serving the community, is those informal referrals that those who have been impacted by harm will refer people to call and reach out and talk to me. That is one of the things that is a measure of success for me. I can anecdotally look back on my 10 years of service at one agency and say that I have multiple people that have come back year over year calling about questions that have honestly nothing to do with a crime. It has to do with a quality of life issue, and that they're calling and saying, I didn't really know where to go, but I felt like you guys would have the right answers. And to me, that community building is so important. And these are people who, from a law enforcement standpoint, looking at these individuals, they don't necessarily aren't the same type of people that would be calling. These are people with prior felony convictions that have had criminal justice interventions where they have been arrested, and they are now reaching out and saying, hey, I don't really know where to turn. I'm having some issues. Can you point me in the right direction? So it is building that relationship and seeing people as they are and as they come to you. One of the most important things that I think I've done for my community here in Washington in the last, in Snohomish County, in the last years, we did a trauma-informed training for law enforcement. So we talked about trauma-informed care, working with those in our community, those impacted by harm and those who have done harm, and how we can look at what trauma-informed care really means, and how we can look at people coming at us have a whole lifetime of experience, and that we are looking at people likely on their very worst day, but underneath that worst day, they're still a person. And so being able to engage with them, they are able to come back and communicate with us, are both those who have done harm and those who have been harmed, in a way that is relationship building and is kind. And we keep saying it, humanizing of these individuals. So when something goes wrong, they're not afraid to call for enforcement action when they need it.
Thanks, Tiffany. Vanessa or Josh, would you love to share an experience or a story about the work that you've done?
So my story would be a Blue Tribe story. The one that just understand that for those of us who are in law enforcement, there's two things that we don't like: change and no change. So when you're presented with changing with different concepts and different languages, it's always, you know, this climb, it's this really steep climb for anybody that's trying to bring something new to the table. That picture that I showed you guys was like day 4 of a Circle Keepers training. Day 1, if I could have took a picture, you understand. Because when we walked into the room, it was like, what is this? I didn't volunteer for this. I got stuff to do. But by day 3, when they realized because it is a experiential training, when they realized the importance of who they were and the fact that they were appreciated, that their voices were important, and that change comes only by both hands, it was like a whole new transformation and a commitment to do our work within that scope and not what we have been doing our work in. Whereas this is the whole idea of things being black and white. So like, again, we became closer as a group of practitioners, as police officers. That was our first training. And over the 5 to 7 years of the implementation of the program, we saw how important we are to each other and to the community, and began to share. We realized the voices of our community were just as important. So while it was a funny story and we don't have a lot of time, so I can give you all of the hilarious stuff, but at the end of the day, I walked out of there and I watched what I did see. I watched some new innovation and excitement and passion for the job when they left that training.
So to me, working with not only campus police officers and safety officers, but the community police, and I think Vanessa said it before, but they see the students out Thursday, Friday, Saturday night at their worst. And we had a meeting where it was just about relationships and some of the things going on in Virginia with the police and the community. And we had 2 younger officers from the city were there. And I remember the students that they had their opinions made up maybe about these guys, and the guys had maybe their opinions made up about these students. But we did some circles and just some talking, relationship building. And I didn't even know it. These 2 community police officers were former JMU students. They were students, and they're like, I sat just where you were sitting. And one of them was the same major as one of the students, and they had similar professors. And it just, I think it blew the students' minds that, wait, these guys and girls are human. They're not just out there, they have families and they have past. And they were students, they were college students. You know, they say sometimes out when they're drinking, you know, stuff about them being locals and things like that. They were college students and well-educated, and they loved the part of their job working with college students. So it was just that chance. And think about the difference. Would there be an opportunity to share that in the criminal system? To share those stories and that relationship building piece? I think those students went back and told everyone, these guys are JMU students. So be careful who you're yelling at when you're walking down the street and things like that. Those moments happen all the time when you use restorative practices.
Awesome. Thank you, Josh. So we are going to have one more question. And for the other questions that are still in there, I'll guide you on where you can place those and hopefully get those answered in the future. But for our last question, which is an extremely important one, what is the role of police departments in being held accountable for proven, disparate, and inequitable treatment of community members? What would you encourage police and other justice system actors to participate in RJ to make amends? This seems like an important piece of restorative justice that gets left out of these conversations.
I'll answer that. Absolutely, unequivocally, yes. Because remember, beyond the badge, beyond the uniform is a human a human person who has human tendencies, who make human mistakes. And just as, you know, but one of the things that I've learned over the years is that people don't begin to understand restorative practice or restorative justice and its practice until it's time for them to be restored. And oftentimes we're not given law enforcement folks who are community members who are charged with law enforcement duties the opportunity to be restored. I found that sometimes those who most restorative justice programs are created for are the least restorative people, because they don't necessarily have the opportunity to see the difference or see the practice in action. So I would recommend it. But like any other organization or system, change comes slowly. I'll remind folks on this call, like I remind my students, that if you've ever been on a cruise ship, it's very rarely that you know when the cruise ship turns around, because it turns so slow. But yet it's still, you have faith that it is actually turning. So I would say, yes, that it is the opportunity that we have yet to realize to its fullest. And just as we do it between folks who are not involved in law enforcement or in the criminal legal system, and see the fruit and the value of that work, it can happen for the same for our law enforcement partners as well.
I would say one thing that came up, I remember years ago when we were talking about restorative justice in the university context, it was our local sheriff who said, when we were talking about expanding out into the county, even beyond the city, farther out from the university, he said, well, why are we going to do restorative justice for college students? What about the local kid who's working at McDonald's, or the local high school kid, or a person who just graduated high school and not going to college? And guess what? He was absolutely right. And it led us to start a community restorative justice program in collaboration with the colleges and the city restorative justice program, to offer it to everybody, not just college students. So he made a great point about equity, that you don't just offer this restorative justice to a certain type of person, or a person who goes to college and not a person who doesn't. And it led us to rethink our practices, and it greatly improved our relationships. And that came from the sheriff.
And I think to dovetail on what Josh and Vanessa both had said, is law enforcement is part of the community. And so in order for the community to feel as if their voice is heard in situations where there is inequity, they have to be able to speak their voice. They have to be able to talk about it, and we have to be able to come together to figure out ways to be accountable, to be able to make amends, and to be able to rebuild our relationship. And sometimes those conversations, those hard conversations to have, are the most fruitful for making progress as we move forward in our career fields, in our communities, and with each other. So I think that is something that I would encourage. That would be a conversation that administrations would have to have, and really get behind having those conversations and building those communities.
So thank you, Tiffany, Vanessa, and Josh, for all of your insight, for preparing such wonderful conversations and answering the questions so thoughtfully. And thank you to all the participants too for your engagement, your answering the funny polls and the serious polls. This really is just a foundation of restorative justice work. So if you're hoping to take this a step further, learn more about restorative justice, state your interest in following up, maybe trainings in the future or anything in between, please make sure you're filling out the assessment. That is where you can indicate what you're looking for, what you're hoping for, further questions that you have. And of course, reach out to any of our panelists here. So they are a depth and breadth of knowledge, and please feel welcome to take a screenshot of this slide so you can reach out to the panelists specifically with any follow-up questions. They are a wealth of information. Other than that, Avery, if you want to pop back on, if you have any final thoughts. Otherwise, folks can enjoy the rest of their evening.
Just thanks for tuning in. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Recording.